we start a new year and we're back on the grind. And we're going to start with Psalm 131. Psalm 131. Like every year, we are given changes and challenges. They push us, they test us. Who are we going to be in those moments? This is the time of year where many people try to stick to their New Year resolutions. They plan for the future and who they want to be by the end of the year, and hopefully they are that person. And our society loves to feed into the idea and give us really unproductive messages of selfish ambition. And our culture loves to tell us to just chase our dreams and our passions. Find what you're passionate about and just do that. If it makes you happy, find your passion and do it. And that can be admirable. It can be good to an extent. It may even take a lot of courage to do some of the things that we desire in this life. But just that sentiment on its own can be very self-centered. You look at some of the most evil men this world created, and they followed their dreams and their passions. Even Hitler, he followed his dream to be dictator of the world, and we see where that got us. And so we have to be mindful. We have to ask, who are we following our passions for? Psalm 131 is going to be our lesson this evening, and the psalm gives a very unique message. It's contrary to the popular message that we see today. And mind you, this psalm is written by King David, a king who has a lot of wealth and a lot of power that many of us really desire in this world. You may have heard it said that the heart is deceitful above all things. Jeremiah 17:9 says this, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick." The heart can rule our passions if we're not careful, and before you know it, there's no room for anyone else in our goals and our plans, and that shouldn't be our goal. That doesn't help anyone. So let's read Psalm 131, starting with verse 1, just 3 short verses. "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore." Look at the beginning of that verse, or that psalm. My heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised. That's expressing a sense of pride that we can get when we are chasing after our goals. When our pride gets in the way, it keeps us from serving God. It keeps us from serving others. The question that we want to tackle this evening is, how do we use godly passions to set realistic goals? Because it's easy to say, well, I'll follow my passions now, and then service and acts of service and service to God will just fall in place. But acts of service to God can't be second thought, because second thoughts aren't genuine to those who need Christ's love. We can't say we live a life of passion and say, yes, I'm following Psalm 131 verse 1. I'm following it to a T. Only acts of service to God and a life of service to God can we read Psalm 131 and say, yes, I am on the right path. And so as we begin the new year, we see really a spectrum of people setting their resolutions. There's those that are setting no resolutions at all. It's a waste of time. Don't even bother. It's not going to work. And there's those that set such big resolutions and big goals that they've already given up, and it's day 2 of 2022. What God provides in His Word, and His ancient words, as we sang, is a balanced spiritual life between, yes, following our passions and what we enjoy, and serving God, which should be one of our passions. And as we go through life, whether we like it or not, we will end up serving something. It doesn't matter what our intentions are. If we're not intentional about living a life for Christ, well, then we'll just end up serving the world. We all have passions. That's one of the things that makes us so unique as humans, is that we can be passionate about some things. We can be passionate about a cause or a person or art or group and so on and so on. It's possible to have godly passions, but they have to be intentional, and we need to see God in those passions. Otherwise, those passions, they're just going to come from the world. Let's look at Romans 1:25 through 26. Romans 1:25 through 26 reminds us that there are different kinds of passions. Romans 1:25 through 26. This is talking about the ungodly, when Paul says, Notice they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and what? And served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen? For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Notice what it says there. Dishonorable passions. Paul wouldn't have said dishonorable if there were only evil passions, if we only got to experience evil passions. There are good and there are godly passions. There are good passions that should motivate us to serve others and to serve God. However, when do they fall into dishonorable passions? What happened? What happened is they went into a life of service. They end up serving the creature rather than the Creator. So how do we direct godly passions to give us godly service? Well, the answer is found in Psalm 131. Read verse 1 again with me. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. We read that second half, and that's not what we want to hear. We want to cut that right out of there. But that's what pride does. That's why there's a warning there at the beginning of verse 1, not to have our eyes raised. Because pride makes us think, well, yes, we can handle way more than we actually really can. Pride gets in our way and it feeds our fantasies, and we're not thinking about what's happening around us or the needs of others or what God wants from us. Instead, pride makes us think about what we could have, what we might get, what we might be able to have. Humility doesn't do that. Humility is the other side of that coin that reminds us that there is a life around us, that there are those that need us and are in need, and that everything we have comes from God. And so when our heart is lifted up, pride takes over. We begin to ask, well, why can't I do this? Why can't I have this? Why can't I have that? And we begin to believe that the ends justify the means. That implies that anything goes to accomplish what I want, to accomplish my passions. And that's not the point of this psalm, the Psalm 131. Because Psalm 131 sums up, is the foundation, really, of a faithful life, of the Christian life, a life that glorifies God. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. It seems ironic that a king would write that. I mean, if we could wish for anything in this world, is to be like a king. It's one of the highest positions this earth has to offer, is to be a king in a worldly way. And he says he doesn't occupy himself with things too great. This is why, for example, we are on social media, to occupy ourselves with things that are probably none of our business. And even though we say we don't do that, it's exactly what we do. We meddle, we mingle, and we believe we deserve the center of attention. We deserve what is great and marvelous that this world has to offer. But the thing is, what is our definition of great and marvelous? You know, we think of a king as great because they have great responsibility and great power. You've probably heard it said, especially lately with Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. Well, think about that as we turn to Matthew 25. Matthew 25. Matthew 25, and let's look at the parable of the talents. Matthew 25, here there's 3 slaves. They're given talents. That's a large sum of money according to their abilities. And verses 14 through 18 is where we'll read. Matthew 25, 14 through 18. This reminds us of the setting. Jesus is telling this parable. And he says in verse 14, "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away, and he had received the 5 talents, went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 talents more, and the one who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money." Notice verse 15, according to their abilities. Those abilities don't define how important they are to their master. They don't define how important we are to God or how successful we are in this world. But that's what we think, right? We think, well, they have that, and they have more than I do, so they must be greater than I am. They must be better than I am. But what defines those servants isn't their abilities or how much they were given. It was how they used their abilities to benefit their master with what they've been given. Look at verses 21 and 23. This is what the master tells those servants who made the best use of their abilities. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Remember, those talents aren't theirs. This life of ours is not ours. It's God's. What are we going to do with it? When those servants doubled their talents, they glorified their master, and we can glorify God. They gave back to their master double what he gave them, and we can give back to God double what he gives us, and that should be our goal. But that means we need to do it effectively, and we need to do it efficiently by setting realistic goals. Not to get distracted with things that seem too great and too marvelous for us, but by using what we have to glorify God. And that means, like we said, setting realistic goals and being content with what God has blessed us with. Sam made a great point in class last week that we as a culture are enthralled with superheroes. We love the superhero movies, and they're great, and they can encourage us to be heroic and brave. That's good. They can deliver a good message, except for the fact that they tell us that only extraordinary people can do extraordinary things, for the most part. And we literally say that's marvelous. Hence the word marvel. But what we should marvel at is the change and the growth we see in ordinary people accomplishing amazing things through Christ. Great isn't the power we have or the wealth that we accumulate, and marvelous isn't that power and that wealth put into action. Great and marvelous should be what God does through us. And that's going to look completely different for each person. Let's turn to Daniel 4 and look at one of these examples. King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 4. He has a hard time seeing this fact. In fact, King Nebuchadnezzar had a hard time seeing how marvelous the one true God is. In Daniel chapter 4, we'll start with verse 4. Daniel 4, verse 4, notice and pay attention to how he talks about himself here. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace, and I saw a dream that had made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. I like that. I was at ease, he says. It's a nice statement. That's what I tell myself when both my girls are awake and they're screaming at the same time. I'm at ease in this situation. I got it. I'm prospering in my palace. I can do this. But notice how he's talking about himself in that way. Let's continue verse 10. He goes on to describe what he sees in this tree. He says, the visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, there it is, a tree in the midst of the earth. And its height was great. And the tree grew and became strong, and its top reached the heavens. And it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. We read that. And that is the picture of success. We want to be this tree, or we would want to occupy our time and our efforts under this tree. Everyone sees us. Everyone sees us or me and depends on me. But this tree, if you think about it, doesn't leave any room for any other tree. It hogs all the sunlight, soaks up all the nutrients. What God is pointing out here to King Neb here is that his heart is lifted up. His eyes are raised too high, what we read back in Psalm 131. His pride is in the way, and he doesn't see the one who is great and the one who is marvelous, God. And how often is that the case in our own life when we get in the way of our own growth? What we do is we make goals really that are just so crazy and are beyond our means. And we dream of fantasies that when we look at our own life, make us depressed about where we are in our own life. And in turn, we see people not as humans, but we see people as ways to accomplish my goal and what I want. If we continue reading in Daniel 4, look at verse 13. We see the rest of King Neb's dream here. What happens to this tree that's great and powerful? In verse 13, I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruits, and let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump and of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and broad, amid tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portions be with the beasts of the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. Many believe that's to be 7 years. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets it over the lowliest of men. This is, of course, not what we would want to see. It, in fact, frightens King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is alarmed in verse 19 when he interprets the dream. This is depressing. But you think about it, anything that grows eventually dies. Anything that we make as humans with our hands doesn't last forever. And that's hard to see sometimes. I don't know if you watch Jeopardy or not, but the current champ is over a 20-game winning streak. And it's a lot. We watch and we think, well, she's going to win because she wins every time by a landslide. All the time. We get in this habit of thinking, well, it's never going to change. She'll always be the champ. But if we know our history, we know that's not true. We know someone's going to come in, someone's going to be better, and someone's going to beat her. And sometimes our focus is always trying to be better than the next person, or try to be the GOAT, to be the greatest of all time. But actually, that never takes us anywhere. That doesn't help us. That doesn't mature us. That doesn't help us grow spiritually, even if we are the GOAT, the greatest of all time. What we need to be doing is stop worrying about being better than everyone and start working to be better than ourselves today. As depicted in this dream here, God is teaching Nab a pretty tough lesson. It starts in verse 17 where he says, this is the why. Living may know that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will and sets it over the lowliest of men. God is in control. The only great and marvelous thing that should occupy any space in our mind and in our heart is the one who is great and the one who is marvelous, and that is God. And Daniel interprets this dream in verse 22. He says, this tree represents you. It is you, O king. In verse 25, he says, what? He says, what will happen? That you should be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts. That's the animals of the field. And then read with me verses 28 through 30 on the screen. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. I read that, and I was reminded that nothing good happens on the roof of a palace. Doesn't matter. Don't go up there. Nothing's good. Verse 30, and the king answered and said, is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? You know, sometimes we focus on the negative, and we think of everyone working from the bottom up. And maybe you're at the top. Maybe last year you accomplished everything you wanted to and more, and things are good, and you're looking back on 2021, and you're thinking, well, that was a great year, which I built by my power and my abilities for my glory and for my benefit. Or we're saying we are at the bottom, and we're looking forward to 2022, and we're saying something similar to what King Neb here says, and we say, well, I hope this year is a great year which I can build for myself and my power and my glory and my benefit. Again, occupying ourselves with things that are too great and too marvelous for us, that we as created beings are. Continue with me in Daniel 4. Look at verses 31 through 33. The story continues. It says, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts, the animals of the field. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. When our eyes are lifted too high, or our heart is raised too high, when our pride gets in the way, we lose who we are. We become like an animal in the sense That we're just living day to day with no purpose but just to feed ourselves. We lose our life when we're chasing after things that are just too great and too marvelous for us. When our aspirations are beyond our abilities and beyond our control. You think about it, you think about a good king. What makes a good king? What makes a good president, a good leader, a good person? It isn't how big their aspirations are. It's their service to God and other people. It isn't about how much they have. It's about how much they do with what God has given them for God's glory. Look at Psalm 131, verse 2 again. And notice what it says here. It says, "But I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me." This is depicting a child that is content with what their mother gives them. They've been weaned. They've grown from milk. They've matured and now to solids, and they have been content. Now, any mother will tell you who's been through this process, it's not that easy. It's not that simple. It takes patience. It takes love. There's a storm before there's a calm. But eventually, through perseverance, there is success. You think about together, the child is serving the mother, and the mother is serving the child out of love here. And notice it's still a child, still dependent on the mother. It's just mature. It's matured. He has or she has matured. And that's what we see similar to Nebuchadnezzar in this situation in Daniel 4:34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, it says, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. No one wants to live off milk their whole life. We grow and we get older and we praise our moms for raising us and for loving us. And notice there in verse 34 of Daniel 4 that he lifted his eyes and his focus wasn't on himself and what he accomplished. He lifted his eyes to heaven and he focused on God, and what happened? His reason returned to him. And when we we shift our focus, I should say, on God, we gain reason and understanding. Neb here has awakened from his curse, his sentence, as it says in the text. And now he sees, verse 25, that God is the one who rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to the one whom he wills. We see now that in King Neb's life, from this moment on, is what we read in Psalm 131, verse 2, that he has calmed and quieted his soul. That it is a soul that honors God and serves the Most High and marvelous great God. We read Psalm 131, verse 2, and that's a humbling verse if we read it. The child has to be dependent on the mother and is dependent in a different way now. And King Nebuchadnezzar has to learn how to be dependent on God. If we can get out of our head, stop focusing on things that are too great for us, and we can quiet our soul. But this only happens when we know we can only depend on God and we can grow and mature our faith. There will be challenges. Like we said, there will be changes in the new year, but there will be good times too, and times we enjoy, and times that we'll want to cherish and remember. But to set goals and resolutions that are unrealistic is unfair to you and unfair to those around us. And so I want to encourage you to set, yes, both physical, but also spiritual goals that are realistic and consistent with where you are in your spiritual maturity. And that doesn't downgrade us because we notice someone else might be able to handle more than we are. Being realistic, in fact, and honest with ourselves actually gives us an advantage because it means that we are good stewards with the talents and the abilities that God has given us. And in addition to that, it sets us up for success with the challenges that we will inevitably meet in the coming future. But in order to do this, we have to quiet our soul. We have to get rid of the noise that our pride tries to feed us of other people's progress as a distraction. Get rid of that. And God reminds us what a quiet life looks like in 1 Thessalonians 4. Let's turn to 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 10 through 12. 1 Thessalonians 4, 10 through 12. Keep a marker in Psalm 131, because we're going to compare these texts here in a second. 1 Thessalonians 4, 10 through 12. This is a life not striving for things too great, things out of our control or selfish ambition, Paul says, we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. Read that alongside Psalm 131. Verse 11 of 1 Thessalonians 4, aspire to live quietly. Psalm 131, having a calmed and quieted soul. Minding our own affairs, verse 11. Psalm 131, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great. And verse 12, so that you may walk properly and be dependent on no one. And Psalm 131, like a weaned child with its mother, is my soul within me. This is a life that glorifies God and will be successful in the coming years as we grow in service, and we grow in service to God. As we close this evening, I want to encourage you to serve, to live a life of service. Instead of striving for things that are too great and striving for things that are too marvelous, let's strive to serve others, because great things happen not when we make more money or we try to exercise our power or authority, but when we live to serve the needs of others. Proverbs 21:21 reminds us that whoever pursues righteousness and kindness will find life, righteousness, and honor. What are we pursuing? Because this life is a journey and we will find something. And whatever it is we're pursuing, it should be pleasing to God, and it should show the love of Jesus to others. There will always be needs out there. We just got to quiet and listen and pay attention. Get rid of the distractions, because it's everywhere. And it could be as simple as helping our neighbor, reading the Bible to someone who can't, leaving a surprise in a mailbox. The list can go on and on. But whatever it is, it has the potential to grow, to double, just like the talents of the servants way back in Matthew 25. It allows us to grow as well. I love Daniel's advice to King Nebuchadnezzar. After he interprets the dream, he tells him how he should occupy his time. And it's not with pursuing what the world thinks as great and marvelous or selfish ambition. It's Daniel 4:27. And Daniel says, therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. 1, break off your sins. By 2, practicing righteousness and your iniquities. By 3, showing right mercy to the oppressed, so that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. 3 things, he says, to tell Neb to do. Break away from your sins, practice righteousness, and serve the oppressed, the poor. And if we can do that, then we can be prepared for the coming days. We just have to remember, who are we ultimately serving? King Nebuchadnezzar, he tells us in Daniel 4:34-35. He tells us who we're serving. When he arrives to his senses, he says in verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. And all of the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? And he continues in verse 37, and now I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. It's now our job to do, as it says in Psalm 131, verse 3, to hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. If we can do that, then we can set realistic goals that make us better servants to honor and glorify God. In fact, King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4:1, he encourages us to tell everyone of all languages on all the earth of how great and awesome God is. And so my prayer is that you can be prosperous throughout this year, this new year. And maybe this evening you want to turn a chapter and start a new chapter in your journey of life, and you can. King Neb, he lifted his eyes to heaven, he saw the light, and you can as well. You can start living a life of purpose and meaning when this world offers none of that. And I encourage you to start striving to live for the one who is most high, the most high God that can change your life. And it does take humility. It takes humility to realize that we don't have all the answers and that we can't do this alone. It takes humility to be baptized and realize we have messed up and we have sinned. But when we are baptized for the forgiveness of our sins, Jesus clothes us with his righteousness, and that is what you can find when you're baptized. And you can start living a life for him. If that is you this morning, then come forward now, and we stand and we sing.